Welcome to Psychedelics Today. Your hosts, Kyle and Joe. It's August 22nd, and we're here with Dimitri Mugianis. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We're excited to have you on.
Glad to be here.
Awesome. So maybe let's just kind of dive right in and hear a little bit back about your background and how you got into the Iboga work.
Sure. What led me to working with Ibogaine and the sacred plant of Iboga was two other sacred healing plants, coca and opium, poppy. I was a heroin and cocaine addict, an IV injector for over 20 years. I was sort of coming to the end of a long run, which I thought would be end in my death. I was on methadone, cocaine, and heroin when I made the decision with my family and friends to try and get off of the drugs with the help of Iboga. Iboga is a plant medicine, a sacred plant from Gabon, Central Africa, used as the essential sacrament in a spirituality called Bwiti. A central sacrament, much like peyote or ayahuasca, is central to spiritual traditions and technologies in the Americas. This is the plant medicine of the people, originally the original people, the so-called pygmies, the forest people, and then the Bantu people. The synthesis together made this thing called Bwiti. Now it's used in initiatory ceremonies in the Bwiti, but it's also used as a medicinal plant. It is the central plant in Bwiti, and Bwiti has a pharmacopoeia of the forest that is integrated into the spirituality. But one of the amazing side properties, or one of the amazing benefits from Iboga is that it interrupts physical dependency on opiates and opioids without withdrawal. Very difficult, but without withdrawal. So, I did the sacrament in Holland in, I think 2002, 14 years ago, last spring, 14 years ago, spring. My story is that I haven't used those drugs since. That's very rare. The majority of people do use, they do fall back into problematic or so-called addictive drug patterns. But for me, that's what propelled me. And I came back to the United States after going to Europe and then going to Greece, my ancestral homeland, for a few months of recuperation. I came back to the States with this zeal to bring this medicine to folks. And I spent about 10 years administering it, first in a secular way as an act of radical service, and then maybe after 4 years of administering, I went to Gabon and was initiated into the Bwiti, and then I began to do ritual. And all in all, we did 500 rituals, around 500, give or take, underground illegally because it is a Schedule I felony in the United States until my arrest by the DEA in 2011. That was a long, protracted court battle. We, in a sense, won because we were looking at some serious felonies, and we pled it down to a misdemeanor, but it was a 2.5-year, very costly emotionally and financially ordeal. And then I went to and did some work in Costa Rica for about 1.5 years until I decided that my work with Iboga for the time being is done. I've taken a break, but that's probably why you're talking to me, right?
Yeah, exactly. I'm kind of curious. So when you were using drugs, were you in a methadone clinic? Have you tried some of these alternative treatments back then? And then, how did you find out about Ibogaine? Because, was it There probably wasn't too much research back then, was there?
Well, no, and I don't think. I mean, that's the story of Ibogaine and Iboga. Ibogaine in particular, and for drug users, is there was no research. I think this is unique in history in a way that this whole process, the whole treatment modality, has been inspired, invented, carried out by the people suffering from the malady, the actual drug users. This is completely drug user compelled. So I'll get to your question, but the history of Iboga or Ibogaine in the United States is the history of Howard Lutzoff in 1962 on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. A opiate dependent morphine addict, 19 years old, film student, stumbles upon this drug called Ibogaine from Africa. He consumes it, has an incredible experience, loses his fear of death, goes home, falls asleep, wakes up the next morning, walks outside, and I think very significantly, given the Bwiti's connection with trees, sees a tree, takes another step, and realizes that he is no longer dependent, that he is not waking up in withdrawal, which is a common experience for anyone who's a morphine or heroin or Oxycontin addict or whatever, and then realizes that he doesn't have a desire to use, and then takes it and starts to give it to his friends who are dependent or so-called addicted. And that starts the whole movement, and Howard's story is an amazing story. Someone who took it to the halls of NIDA, who met with the president of Gabon, who became a scientist, this guy with a degree in film. So the way I heard about it, well, let me say this, is that basically I've been to only one detox. My run, I didn't really, I kicked cold turkey dozens of times, maybe, I don't know how many. It could be 30, it could be 60 times. I really don't know. I would kick and then I would relapse, within months or days or weeks. So I eventually got on methadone, which is a very hard drug to get off of, but I was still using heroin and cocaine. The way I knew about Ibogaine was through the work of Howard Lutzoff, Norma Lutzoff, and Dana Beal. Dana Beal was one of the old school radical yippies that had taken up the mantle of Ibogaine, especially around the time of the AIDS crisis. Was a member of ACT UP. And the work that he did on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which is where I was living at the time. At that time, Lower East Side was a sort of a cauldron for, art and radical politics. The first time I heard about it, I was injecting heroin with my friend, the late, great Adam Nodelman, who had just come maybe 4 months before. I'd been in Holland and was working with the Junkie Boon, the Junkie Union, and Nico Adrian, who was one of the first drug user organizers. And they were giving Ibogaine treatments along with Howard. Howard was going under a very controlled setting, but allowing some of the Ibogaine to sort of slip out into the community. So he was injecting and his wife at the time, Herta, was injecting and telling me about this thing. This is the first time I ever heard of the word Ibogaine, Bwiti, Gabon, any of these things. And that was probably 1992. So I've been around it for a while. It's significant that they were injecting because people do relapse. Let me say again, most people relapse. But we can get to that later because I think that we are, I think with all psychedelics, we're falling into a trap of linear consumerism and dependency on outcomes. And, I'm very suspicious of success. Mm-hmm. So that's the first time I heard about it. Some incredible synchronicity events occurred around that time, including, they went back to Holland to do another treatment for themselves. And I got a phone call from this is what really stuck out for me. I got a phone call from Adam saying that he had gone through the process and he was doing wonderfully. And there's a mutual friend of ours, a guy named Louis, who was a guitar player for a band called The Willies. And he was sort of like a waif, this cat who was on the street, really beautiful cat. We kind of, younger than us, and we took him under our wing a little bit, and he was having a hard time. And he said he had a dream that Louis had jumped out a window and killed himself. And I was stunned because Louis had jumped out a window like 2 days before or 3 days before, but was in the hospital and not dead. And that was not a dream, but the vision in Iboga. He saw that happen, and what happened is Louis got out maybe 2 weeks later, and then climbed that same building and finished the job.
Wow!
So that was like, what the fuck is this shit? What's going on with this? So that was my first, sort of wake up to it, and it was in my head, and and it was talked about, sort of indirectly. The way I came into contact with Iboga was through Herbert Huncke, the great beat writer, who was a lifelong junkie, the guy who first turned William Burroughs on, and he was a dear friend of mine. He was also a friend of Adam's, so that's how I got involved in that whole circle.
Interesting. And was it legal in Holland? Like, were they using it in a clinic, or
they weren't? It wasn't illegal. They were using it in a clinic, not in a clinic. They were, Howard, in my understanding, they were working with iCash. I forget what that stands for. And they're also working with Junkie Boon. I'm blanking on some of the names here. They were working with a psychiatrist there, and they were doing sort of their own mini clinical trial. It wasn't really a clinical trial. They were doing their own casework, I guess, the way. And so they went and they were working. It wasn't illegal though, so that's why they went and did the work there. And then they went to Panama, and then so that was probably 92, I guess.
Okay.
If you want to talk to someone, Dana Beal would know the history of that.
Cool. Yeah, I never really knew like the European history of Ibogaine, and wouldn't expect clinic to be around in Holland at that time. It wasn't, they were doing work or something.
Yeah, they were doing work. And the interesting thing is that Nico Adrian is sort of one of the founding, figures of the harm reduction movement. And the fact that he was involved, he died, I believe, from complications from HIV/AIDS soon after he was, started to get involved with Ibogaine. But it's really significant that those two movements go back that far together.
Yeah. Cool.
So Bwiti, let's before we jump too far, let's talk about Bwiti a little bit more, just so people kind of understand it, maybe a little bit better than on previous interviews.
Okay, I'm not an expert. I'm just an initiate.
Sure.
And I always say I'm a low initiate. Everyone has a job in Bwiti, and my job's probably the lowliest in Bwiti, which is like media Bwiti, which is like probably the most inferior form of Bwiti. So I'll just talk about what I know, and what I've learned from my elders in the tradition. There were the forest people, the so-called pygmies in Central Africa, who had been living there for a millennium. And Bantu people were being pushed out. These were Bantu people who had, were involved in fetish religion, ancestral religion, were being sort of religiously persecuted and being pushed out by Abrahamists. They were savanna people pushed into the forest of Central Africa, coming from the east to the west. And, similar in some ways to the story of Pilgrims coming to America. Here were these agricultural people coming in search of religious freedom, and then meeting indigenous people who basically taught them how to live, in the new environment. So that's what the forest people, the so-called pygmies, did with the Bantu. And traditionally, when agricultural, people meet with nomadic people, indigenous people, it doesn't work out too well for the nomadic people. Fortunately, they weren't European, so they weren't completely decimated, but it wasn't all good. The Bantu and some of the Bantu and some of the forest people, they got close, they intermarried and so forth. And what grew out of that was, let me backtrack a little bit. One of the things in terms of survival that the forest people, the so-called pygmies, introduced to these Bantu people was how to survive in the forest, and then the medicines of the forest. If you go for a walk with Anti-Buitis, you'll be going with any sort of medicine person. You're like going into the forest, and they're basically shopping for plant medicine. And they introduced them to this plant medicine, Iboga. These are animist people. And there was this sort of merging of traditions and cultures that developed into Bwiti maybe 700, 800 years ago, where the Bantu people brought in their traditions of ancestral worship, of fetish work, and the Pygmy people and dance and music as healing arts, as well as the Pygmies bringing their dance and music, and their knowledge of the forest and their connection with the living cosmos, the idea that everything is imbued with life, even what we consider inanimate life, and what we call God or Zambe. This was the combination, and this beautiful tradition developed called Bwiti. And Bwiti differs, ethnic group from ethnic group. There are, in the size of the state of Colorado, with a population of maybe 1 million people, which is Gabon, there are 52 languages.
Oh, wow.
And so that gives you an idea of the diversity of culture. Europeans and Americans, Anglo-Americans, usually tend to view Africa as this one thing. And here's this little corner with 52 languages. So the Bwiti differs village by village, really. And we can touch on this later, which goes to the idea of the Westerner in search of authenticity. What is authentic? And we can get to that later. That's what Bwiti is. Iboga is used as an initiatory tool. It is used as a divination tool. It is used for the purposes of staying up all night and dancing. It is used as aphrodisiac sometimes in small amounts. They also call it, there's a hunter's dose where you can go hunting and concentrate. In higher doses, it's very difficult to concentrate. The effects are pretty... it's a very difficult physical experience. It lasts a long time, where ayahuasca ceremony, for those who are maybe familiar with ayahuasca or peyote or mushrooms, you're out of that in between 4 and 6 hours, right? Iboga, you're just getting rolling. You're probably in the intense experience of, tripping balls, to be technical, for those of us that have balls or tripping, whatever, for between 8 and 12 hours. But the entire process could take up to 36 hours of integration. And on rare occasions, I've seen people in the intense state for up to a week. Wow. It's very rare. And then it's as rare as people not feeling anything. And there are people who feel absolutely nothing from Iboga, which is really interesting. It's a remarkable, beautiful ceremony. Bwiti, in all its diverse practices, you can see so many different kinds of Bwiti. But for me, a Westerner coming in, a kid that grew up in Detroit, fascinated with music and African culture, African American culture, to see the source of the music, because you can recognize the source of the music by listening to Bwiti music, whether it's Fang or some other ethnic group, and it does differ. To see that source of the music for someone who came from Detroit, where house and techno and before that the punk and rock and R&B and blues and all that stuff came from, and to see this collective of folks consuming the sacrament, and for the sake of accuracy, I would say a drug. It is a drug, but some folks will get mad at me for saying that, particularly in the Bwiti. But to consume this drug with babies and old people, and to hold space for the bonzi, the patient, 1 or 2 or 3 of them maybe laying in the middle of the garden of the temple, and the entire village playing this rhythmic music, the rhythms lasting for hours, with everyone singing, fires burning, dancing around. It's not a quiet ceremony, and building up this trance state. For me, it was revelatory. Probably as influential on my life as my initial experience with Iboga in Holland, in a dark space with no light, by myself, coming off of a heroin addiction, So the Bwiti is powerful. And one of the things that is interesting about Bwiti is it's one of the only indigenous African religion that is growing. as opposed to being, shrinking with the influence of Christianity, the outside influence of Christianity and Islam, both outside influences, both of them outside influences, which this is a spirituality. And, Bwiti, the folks in Bwiti say that it's not a religion, but by definition, if we look at a dictionary, it is a religion. And if we look at a dictionary, it is a drug. Mm-hmm. So I'll continue to have respect to call it a spirituality or a tradition, but that this tradition is growing. One of the great anthropologists, the English writing anthropologist of Bwiti Fernandez, talks about Bwiti as an anti-colonial movement, particularly amongst the Fang, which is the biggest ethnic group. He saw folks reclaiming their personhood. He also wrote a paper comparing, and I think this speaks to the need for folks to be in contribution in order to heal something that is robbed from us, not only by colonialism and by racism and classism, but by neoliberalism and capitalism. This idea that we all need to be in contribution. So he makes a comparison in 1999. He wrote a paper for a Ibogaine conference at NYU in 99. And the paper basically talks about what he saw as a similarity. And this is, before I was aware of this paper, I saw the same thing after my first trip to Gabon. I saw that folks, these in Fernandez saw that these colonized people, the Fang in this case, who had lost their traditions, robbed of their traditions. The women, because of venereal disease brought by the French, had a lot of them had lost the ability to conceive children. The men were infantilized and called lazy because the type of work that they were asked to do is not traditional to them. They were put on so-called plantations. And then to find, and what happened is the Fang were the last group to come into Bwiti, maybe about 100 years ago. And when they came into Bwiti and they saw these other ethnic groups, started sharing it with them, then they started to get their personhood back. Everyone in Bwiti has a job. Everyone. So just like the Ibogaine movement, the way it grew in the West was someone like, you talk about a colonized, marginalized person in Gabon has been dehumanized, desexualized, infantilized, and then you talk about a drug user in the West. You're like sort of the lowest of the low, finding purpose and work and contribution because there's the dignity of contribution and work that Bwiti provides for you, that administering Iboga provides for someone, or Ibogaine provides for someone, to stay and take care of another human being, that desire that is actually beyond a desire, our right to take care of each other, that being restored within this context of Bwiti or Iboga or Ibogaine. Yeah.
That's really cool. Thank you for that.
Sure.
How are you seeing the treatment or medical world approach Ibogaine and treating folks with addiction?
Well, I believe that like so many things in our lives, that, for instance, death and birth are not medical. How to say it? They're not medical. They have become medicalized moments, medicalized events. I believe in medically assisted, perhaps, death and birth, but not medicalized. And in the same way, I feel with Iboga, that we run a danger of, or all psychedelics, of putting it into the wrong hands. I believe that, it makes good sense to have medically assisted Iboga and Ibogaine treatments, at least in the West, especially for detoxes. Mm-hmm. And I learned that the hard way. But, the last maybe 5 years of my practice in the underground before my arrest, I always had a medical professional on board. So I believe there's a place for it. I believe so. Yeah, it is a place where, because it can be dangerous. It can be dangerous. There are heart cardio complications that could easily arise that could be avoided with simple diagnostic tests like EKGs and liver panels and this sort of thing. So, having said that, I'm really suspicious of the medicalization of psychedelics, particularly the move to bring psychiatrists in particular into the fold, and to introduce not only just psychiatrists, but to introduce these medicines within the medical industrial complex, which is one of the pillars, I believe, of what brings us disease. Reductionism is beautiful, necessary. The scientific, practice of reductionism is beautiful, but it does not address, or is ill-equipped to address, psychedelics. I mean, I forget who said the map is not the territory. Folks get out of control. So, I think this speaks to like a larger issue. Do we want to medicalize drug use? So there's a big pushback right now against mass incarceration, but we must be really careful because this is another arm or leg, I would say, probably a pillar of the existing construct, which I believe is not only damaging to the individual, but to the planet and to the cosmos. So, what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, if we just take these things and medicalize them instead of putting them in the criminal, instead of criminalize them, then the same is going to play out the same way. That's based on race, class, gender, sexual identity, access to cultural capital. These folks are going to end up on the wrong side of the stick. Do we really want to introduce it into that structure? So that's the medical structure, but what we're really talking about is introducing it into the pharmacracy. Do we want Pfizer to be providing this and prescribing these medications, whether it's MDMA? Do we want that? I, for one, don't. I think it's dangerous. I think that giving these medicines and putting these medicines in the hands of psychiatrists, if you look at what psychiatry is today, it scares me. I mean, you guys are probably too young, I imagine, but, the Rolling Stones hired the fucking Hells Angels to be security for a concert at Altamont. I don't know if that's a cultural point that you can have any reference to, but it was a bad idea. To me, it's like giving these medicines to the fucking Hells Angels of our time. I think it's simply crazy. It also shows the limits of psychedelia and the power of the witchcraft of capitalism, and that we are unable to imagine anything else as a progress other than to introduce it into this existing construct. And if you look at organizations like MAPS or even DPA or whoever, they are constantly trying to introduce it within the harmful context. This working with vets, I support working with vets. But if you look at the way it's languaged, the idea that we can work with the Veterans Administration as some sort of providers of health care, I think is outrageous. The fact that that MAPS did work with the Israeli Defense Force. I think it's outrageous, and it shows the limits of this medicine. It also shows that there is no structural analysis, cultural structural analysis, political, race analysis, gender analysis at all. And unless you have an analysis, you guys know, as guys who study psychology or are in the field, you need an analysis of yourself, of your darker self, because this ain't all fucking spirit. Yeah. Spirit's another capitalist idea. It's all up there. We're going to go up and rise up. But, I'm developing some sort of analysis on the trauma thing, but I'm seeing that our attachment to trauma trauma is also somehow attached to capitalism and attached to a neoliberal idea of the world, that we can like heal from these things and not through these things. Mm-hmm. So I think it shows the limits of psychedelia and also the dangers, because we've seen before that, and look, you can see this in traditional culture too, because by the way, they're people. So we have to avoid the sort of racism of specialness or of the other, of, this sort of, superhuman, therefore not human group of people from another culture. I see the abuse in indigenous uses of medicine as well, because it's hierarchical. This is incredibly powerful shit. If you're a bartender, you got power. Right. You know what I mean? So and you just got some power, and you might be able to manipulate folks if you're a bartender. If you're handing a pill, the very act of handing someone Iboga, handing someone ayahuasca, or stopping and measuring it and looking at that whole trip, right? That's a power play. Mm-hmm. And you have to be really clear about that. And that's why we see the abuses that we see within the psychedelic world, sexual, financial, mental fucking, as well as actual fucking,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The whole ayahuasca tourism and the sketchy shamans down there and people. Yeah. And you do see it in other cultures. Like people go down there and think it's going to be like this really magical experience. And then, that's not really the case. And even the cultural difference too. I had somebody that went down there and was like, 14 hours up the Amazon somewhere. And, they were just saying like, such a different culture, they're not speaking the language, and like they were going through a really difficult experience. And then, maybe in the culture down there, it's not as maybe traumatizing, or they don't think it's that way, but then, they don't really know how to handle it for Westerners. So.
Well, I mean, this speaks to a lot. Yeah, it does speak to like our impact going down there, their impact coming up here, their magic and witchcraft, our magic and witchcraft, which is money, which is magic and witchcraft. And, right. I sort of based that on the old Marxist analysis of commodity fetishism, where you could only talk about the commodities market in terms of religious terms. And as a fetish priest, I understand that money is fetishism, and that things can actually manifest on a material plane by the use of fetish. And then getting back to that idea of trauma by consuming psychedelics or even breath work, I imagine that there is, and I just coined this term, so I want to pat myself on the back. There is a psychedelic gaslighting, where folks are not allowed to experience what they're experiencing. They're telling, you hear it all the time from shamans or people or providers, well, that's because they weren't able to let go.
Right.
You talk about some fucking linear shaming. How about you fucked up? How about they took too much? How about, wow, that was shitty. Let's talk about how shitty that was. It just, because the shaman says, well, fuck him or her. Let's give indigenous people and all people their humanity and call them assholes when they're assholes.
Right.
And call them on power trips when they're on power trips. This ain't all good. Sometimes, and I've seen it with the Iboga world, where folks are talking about having some withdrawal symptoms, and everyone's like, it's impossible that they have withdrawal. Right. I found myself in the same position, because like suddenly I'm the fucking expert. Well, how about the narrative of the individual being the expert?
Yeah.
And so this psychedelic gaslighting goes on all the time, or that's what was just coming up or meant to be. I don't fucking get it. That's a whole other thing with what I call the radical nowist movements. These fundamental nowists. Like everything was meant to be, and now is where it's at. And if you're not in now, then there's something fundamentally fucked up about you. But it's okay that you're fundamentally fucked up about you, because that's fine. I mean, some shaming bullshit to get us out of this fucking the fact that shit actually sucks.
Oh man, yeah.
Don't get me started, man.
No, I totally agree. And it's like the shadow. I feel like our culture is very afraid to work with the shadow side. And I love that you're even bringing it up, because I feel like, people are just afraid to touch it, and it's a real conversation that needs to be had. And yeah, you see it in all types of circles. I think it's just the work that we're not doing on ourselves sometimes. And I kind of bring it back to what you said. It's working through, right? Like,
yeah.
So.
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole trauma movement now, I'm suspicious of it. I'm very, I get it, because I've done a lot of work on my own trauma. I get it, but I become that trauma, and then like nothing else is explained in any other way. And I think that the opposite of it, of course, is everything's from spirit or from ancestor, and I believe in spirits. I mean, I'm floating around my apartment right now, man, but to be able to discern those things is very difficult. And yeah, I mean, working through it is part of it. Also, the healing from, if you look at how much we give away in cycles, I just did a panel on psychedelics and race, and I want to do one on, gender, maybe called queering psychedelics is the idea for it. I'm talking about the idea that, we again, the limits and the limits of psychedelia and the power of culture, the power of the existing paradigm. We go into this world and we are faced with this incredible expansion. We don't even know what the fuck it is. So of course we need some sort of model to design it, but we immediately go back to, well, how can we get this into the hospitals? And then male and female, binary. Look, I agree. I'm a novice in Qigong Tai Chi, and I have a teacher, and I understand, that there is a balance of male and female in both of us. But this giving away and the side, people ask me, is Iboga male or female? And I'm like, does it stand or squat when it pees? I mean, what's the question you're asking me? And like the mother, let's give it away to the mother. Let's give it away to trauma. Let's give it away to the shaman or the other gatekeepers, be they a social worker or a psychiatrist, or even the structure. Maybe we can use these medicines if we go in with the idea of, with a structural analysis and the idea of set and setting being about shadow work, the shadow work of society and the shadow work of ourselves and the shadow work of community, having that present, that darkness, that beautiful darkness, the shit that makes flowers grow.
Yeah.
That's the start of it. I mean, I'm interested in Bwiti. I'm incorporated in a religious organization called, it's an incorporated religious organization, Universalist Bwiti Society. This is, a platform we are using for organization as well as prayer and ritual. But I'm really also increasingly interested in non-hierarchical structures of consuming medicine and developing rituals with each other. And I think the best model for that right now that I see, sort of an anarcho model, is the not all the 12 traditions, not 12 steps, but the 12 traditions. It's something that I think the 12 steps folks, Bill W., who was a psychonaut, and his peers saw that there would be a power structure and people would try to create mommy and daddy, and how to prevent that. And I think they did an incredible job, at least in the 12 traditions. Now, of course, it's become institutionalized, which I totally reject, but it's kind of amazing that they've survived I see 12 steps as at least the fellowships as a spiritual anarcho-collective working against the ills of materialism. And they set it up. So what I'm saying is that if we could find ways to set up this, what Dave Nichols from DMT Nexus talks about, a psychedelic anarchy, which might not be a great soundbite for Reset Me or some shit, but if we could find a way to work within that structure, to understand that this is very powerful, that hierarchies are going to be formed. We're going to naturally be searching for mommy and daddy, and maybe we can make the group mommy and daddy, and maybe we can anticipate, these these formations of power, which is what 12 Traditions did. No one governs. Positions move every 3 months. They take no outside contributions. We're just here trying to do this thing, not something else. So, I mean, it's one of the ideas I'm thinking of, and I think from talking to folks, it resonates with people, or some people.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting. It makes me immediately think of how I could do that with breath work. And it's challenging because it's not an easy skill to teach or learn. But, just like psychedelic apprenticeship or whatever, however you want to phrase that, it is possible.
I love you saying that. Part of my other work is I work in a needle exchange, and we've developed a holistic program. I work 3 days a week in East Harlem. And one of the things we're trying to develop is a peer program. So, we have a weekly gathering every Thursday at 11:30. We gather and we play drums and we hold ceremony. And the ceremonies have developed sort of organically. Myself and my colleagues, we no longer need to set it up. I don't walk into the room sometimes until 11:45. It's being run by the community. And the idea is to like pass on knowledge with as little hierarchy as possible. And something like breath work, and I'm also a student of Alexander Tanos, who I think is an amazing, my brother, and an amazing, I love his non-hierarchical approach because he'd get pissed if I called him a healer, so I won't. But he is a teacher. And I also work with bowls and gongs and singing bowls. And one of the ideas I'm thinking about, how do we get this really, this technology into people's hands? And I'm thinking about maybe we have a singing bowl library where people would come and apprentice for a year, and then they can take it out into their communities. Ways of destroying, understanding the hierarchy. Look, to understand your privilege is the first step, right? But now, how do we fuck it up? Which is really hard, because I love being a white guy walking in and not having to say shit. And like, they think I'm straight. They think I'm this. I think I'm that. And I get all this shit without opening my mouth. It's really difficult to try to shake that up. But I think that's the work of as we are in the end stages of capitalism, and perhaps the end stages of our species, is to do the work to disrupt our own privilege, to figure out how to use our privilege, and at the same time to circumvent our own privilege. It goes against a lot of the stuff that we were raised to believe, but I think it works really, really harmoniously in our beings. Our beings is we want to give and receive. And that giving and receiving can be goods and services, but really it's called love. Right. And like, yeah.
So Dimitri, can you give us an example? I know there's going to be people listening to this that don't understand this privilege conversation. They're going to come in and go, what are they talking about? Can you give us an example of somebody, maybe an underprivileged person trying to get Iboga treatment or trying to get something, and how that's very different if you're a middle or upper middle class person?
Okay, I think I'll give you upper middle class person, a white person, a male person, someone with a perceived straight sexual identity, right. All those things, on and on and on. So, this is an example of my privilege that is it's just a radical example. When I went to court, I got arrested. I don't have a lot of money. I don't make a lot of money. My family doesn't have a lot of money. Okay. I have access to cultural capital. Okay. What does that mean? I can speak the language very fucking well. Okay. So when I open my mouth, folks assume something about me. I never went to college, but I had it. I grew up around, radical thinkers, and it's in my home. So I have that. I have the skin privilege. I have male privilege. I have just in case you're wondering, I have a penis.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah. So I get arrested. I also have access to all kinds of different people. I have all kinds of friends because of all of this and my ability to talk shit. Okay. So I get arrested And with no money, I end up going through. I get the lawyers representing one group of lawyers. The first one were like one of the biggest religious rights lawyers in the country, Stodgers and Green, which represented the ayahuasca people, in Oregon. Big firm. They're the first group of lawyers. Second group of lawyers I got that actually went to trial with me, and for very little money, but they did it pro bono, was 5 peers, which incredible radical attorneys. So after like long protracted negotiations and arguments before I got in the court case, I went back and forth, but my privilege immediately buoyed me. It lifted me up. My privilege lifted me up. I got these amazing world-class lawyers, brilliant lawyers, Alexis Briggs, who fucking saved my ass, who does a lot of pro bono work and a lot of work, but I could not afford any of these people, but I got it because of privilege. I got it because of my skin color, because of my gender, and not that they were thinking about that, but this led to that, okay? Mm-hmm. So I walk into the courtroom with world-famous attorneys. The courtroom's filled with other harm reductionists from Seattle supporting me. I'm sitting there, and there is an African-American man who I notice meeting his lawyer. I'm watching this go down. His lawyer's a woman in her 40s, and she seems very rushed, and she's shuffling through papers. They clearly meet for the first time. She's shuffling through a stack of papers and talking to him, and they're talking a mile a minute before they go in. They go in and see the judge. The judge says to this man, it makes me upset to talk about. They say to him, you've tested, you've given, I think it was 10 urines. Well, first of all, his lawyer says that he's got a job. He's got housing after living in his car. He's seeing his child. You have 10 urine samples, and 3 of them came positive for cocaine. I'm, as a harm reduction person, someone who works with drug use, thinking, this man's successful. This dude is fucking doing his shit. Mm-hmm. The judge says, I don't want to have to send you to prison, but according to the law, I do. And they send him back to jail.
Jeez.
I walk in with a bunch of felony counts to begin with. I walk out the front door. I'm on the cover of the Village Voice. I'm on National Geographic. I'm on Vice Television, HBO, New York Times, AP, blah, 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 blah. Everyone's cheering me. I believe that my privilege was the most dominant factor in me walking out the front door. It did. And now they didn't look at that man when you can say they didn't look at that man and say, you're a black man, you're going back to prison. But everything leading up to that stacked the deck against him. He didn't have that shit. Mm-hmm. Now, when we call white privilege, it's not to say that in that case there are 2 people. My family suffered. I suffered in this process. His family suffered. He suffered in the process. But the outcome was different. I say that to say when we call white privilege, when we call male privilege, when we call class privilege, we are not saying that you as a human being did not struggle, did not suffer, have not felt hurt and pain and loss and cried all night. Mm-hmm. We're saying that it is not balanced, that our experience going through the world is not the same experience as a woman, not the same experience as a black or brown person or an immigrant or someone who doesn't speak the language or someone who doesn't have a background of education. That's what I'm saying. So that's what we mean by privilege. We're not denying your humanity. It gets very hard for white people and males and straight people when they're approached with that, because what they hear is you haven't struggled. What they feel is that they're being dehumanized. But this is what black people and brown people and red people and yellow people and women and gay people have felt all their lives. And poor people. Let me say poor people too, because that's the other element of psychedelia that is so stratified. It is the element of privilege, of class privilege. When I suggest that instead of going to Burning Man, we go to NASCAR and start to reach out to poor working people to bring them in. Because there's also an incredible elitism around this. I've never had anyone volunteer. Let's go to our brothers and sisters in the trailer park. Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean by privilege. I have it. I have privilege. Before I open my fucking mouth, things are assumed about me that like someone who's lived a far more exemplary life because of the color of their skin or their gender or their sexual or identification are not given to. I am given that all the time. Mm-hmm. All the time, every day. And I walked free because of that. And that man went to prison because of that.
Right. I wonder if your outcome would have been different if you were a man of color, right? Or even a woman. In that regard.
I think it would have. There was a woman of color, a dear friend of mine who was working with me on the underground. And finally she said, I got to quit this because if the doors come down, it's going to be a very different outcome, especially in women. Look, the judicial system is tilted, the whole system. And look, this also goes to psychedelia and being introduced into the existing construct, because diagnosis, people exhibiting the same behavior are given diagnoses based on how much money they have and their color and where they live. So in other words, somebody who is diagnosed as schizophrenic, who might be a client I see who's living in a homeless shelter, might be diagnosed as schizophrenic. And we got to remember, a diagnosis is a sentence because it's going to affect your life. And it's a sentence that you can't you can't get a pardon on that diagnosis, because the white coat wall, just like the blue wall, the police will go up and they'll defend their colleagues. So the person who is of color, poor person, working class person who is exhibiting certain behaviors will be diagnosed with schizophrenia when someone else, let's say a privileged person, a person with class or race or gender privilege, will be given, let's say, bipolar. So it plays out in all stratus of our society. That's why just to simply introduce psychedelics into the existing structure, the existing racist, classist, homophobic structure, the structure of late stage capitalism, the structure of neoliberalism, which is something else I want to talk about. But to introduce it into that will produce the same results. They will use psychedelics to further their agenda, just like they did at the beginning. Who brought LSD to this country? Who it was the CIA, national security. That's not conspiracy, that's fact. And I don't want to get into conspiracy, but the other piece of that I want to briefly mention is that the only way that most of the so-called psychedelic movement can imagine this medicine being passed on is through a neoliberal perspective. If you don't know what neoliberal is, look it up, because you're living under that regime right now. Mm-hmm. So they can only talk about privatization, giving it to the corporations. And then if you hear the movers and the shakers, they really believe that if they give it to the 1%, that that's going to change the 1%. I got to tell you that they've been tripping for years, and it doesn't make a difference. If you look at Steve Jobs tripped on acid, he meditated, he went to India, and he produced this beautiful device that we are speaking on right now. And he also produced slavery in China. He the coltan mining in the Congo, which has caused a civil war and mass murders of maybe millions of people. This has come out of that. And unless we go through it with this shadow idea, with a structural analysis of our culture and ourselves, our own privilege. Look, I'm not beating myself up about it. I don't have white guilt. I have plain reality. I don't have a guilt about that. I have a reality. I'm looking at it with clear lens. And actually medicine has helped me with that, to pinpoint the analysis. But we can use these medicines to hide the healthy shame. Because shame ain't something to always run away from. There's some shit that is shameful. I've done shit that is shameful. I thank the medicines for telling me that it was shameful. And eventually I changed somewhat. I still got a lot to go. Okay, I'm going to put my soapbox down.
Yeah. That kind of brings up like an interesting point of like thinking. I heard you say once, like, these aren't like always transformative medicines. And like, somebody with like an agenda to take over the world and make a lot of money, and maybe they're microdosing with LSD because they know it helps with creativity, and they're making millions of dollars and maybe enslaving people. you know, like, how's that medicine working? Like, I always hear of like people doing this medicine work, and it's like, are they getting the message that, hey, the world's crumbling, hey, we need to change things, you know, like, or is it just like, oh yeah, like I learned a little bit more about myself, and now I know how to like either make more money or do something more creative.
Well, I mean, if you look at that, I mean, we're talking about the struggle between consumerism and contribution. So consumer is just about making you a consumer. So like all the articles about microdosing with LSD is, you know, like, you know, all these fucking, you know, all this microdosing shit. I mean, people love it. They line up like, you know, how can I get a startup? You know, it's about making you a better executive. That's what they're talking about. You can get more sharp, you know? So there it is. You consume this so you can do this. So, and, you know, we can make the argument that people are contributing by being a better executive. I agree. But the underlying narrative is that you do this, you can be a better capitalist. And that's the you know, there are you know, I heard somebody who's, you know, on TV talking about these medicines, you know, talking about how wonderful it will be when it will be brought to you by Coca-Cola. I mean, this guy's standing there's a whole room full of these fucking hippies applauding him, you know. And, you know, I was horrified. He talked about it in Amherst. You might remember. We're not going to name names. Mm-hmm. But, you know, disgusting. Yeah, the idea of doing this to make us more efficient, I think and more productive. I think if you look around, what we need is to be less efficient. Mm-hmm. What we need to be is far less productive. Let's sleep more. Let's fuck more. Let's have family dinners more. You know, let's do that in a very conscious way. And I'm not talking about just going out and partying. I'm saying let's slow it the fuck down. This is all about amping it up and introducing it into the structure, introducing it into neoliberalism, introducing it into capitalism, introducing it into the very place, the very space that has produced the illness to begin with. Mm-hmm. You know, and using it to cover up. Look, I believe that we should use all these medicines to help veterans. I think that these medicines can be, and I've worked with veterans. I've worked with killers of all kinds, you know, veterans and other people. But and you guys will know as guys who work in the field, that you need to have an idea of what you did, to take personal responsibility, and then to take collective responsibility. So just to simply give these medicines without that conversation, why would the Pentagon be interested in it? Is the Pentagon, the Veterans Administration, interested in taking collective responsibility for killing between 500,000 and 1 million Iraqis for no fucking good reason? Is that part of the conversation? Is it ever raised? Where, you know, and then we look at setting and intention. We always talk about intention. Mm-hmm. What is the intention for doing that? What is the intention? And why haven't we sought out the folks that were in Abu Ghraib, who have been scattered all over the world, guilty of nothing, and offered them MDMA? Why haven't we gone to the folks who have been imprisoned and sexually tortured by our military, raped and sodomized by our men and women in uniform, and offered them MDA and ayahuasca and Iboga? Mm-hmm. Why? So, I mean, we really got to look at ourselves, and there's no looking at ourselves. It's like, hand it over to the gatekeepers, and we'll be all right. And if you look at privilege, and when we did the panel on race and privilege within the psychedelic movement, I was criticized, like, well, there's plenty of folks doing stuff on the side. You don't know that. I'm not talking about people doing ceremony. I'm talking about the psychedelic movement. If you go to these panels, it's mostly crackers like myself, but mostly with PhDs men talking about changing the world. Well, lo and behold, we're still talking. And if you look at the studies that have been done on it, look at the John Hopkins study. Who the fuck? These are scientists. Let me back up. These are scientists, and by some sort of coincidence, I imagine, or maybe oversight, you be the judge. They, through their analysis, to pick out the best test group to take mushrooms, it happened to be them. It happened to be their peers, and the best music, lo and behold, it happened to be a classical music. Fuck. Where's the science? I want to see the fucking research to break that down. That like white people with postgraduate degrees are the best case studies. Now they're doing one on people who meditate. How about people who drink 40s? How about people who work at a fucking $8 an hour job at Hardee's? How about them being the best people to take the medicine? Mm-hmm. You know, just listen to us. We're going to be okay. It's the same bullshit with this ultra powerful medicine called psychedelics that they're selling on us. And this is really about a conversation. That race and panel stuff is not just about privilege. It's not about privilege of who gets it and so forth. It's about the privilege of who gets to frame the dialogue. In other words, who gets to be the arbitrator of what is true. And the only arbitrator we're being told of what is true is this so-called what's the word I'm looking at? A neutral, a peer review study. We know how research is done. It's not fucking. It's done with a lot of bias. Okay, so we're being told that the only way we can get the truth about psychedelics is to do research within their structure, the structure that they happen to own. And you know what? Look around. They lied before. It's not like it's a non-flawed system. Look at the drugs that have come to market. Look at the modalities of treatments that have come to market that we've been told have been tested by those institutions. Are we blind? Have we forgotten everything? I believe it's dangerous to allow academia and who are supported by the corporate structure, in this particular, the big pharma and the medical industrial complex, to dictate what is our truth.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah.
Well, I think that we know that, Iboga, interrupts physical dependency on opiates without withdrawal, but it's not an official truth. So we're being told, where's the research? Well, there's no money behind the research, so it will never be true. But we know it's true. We know it's true. Mm-hmm. So that's an example of I think we have to collectively and individually decide what they tell us isn't exactly the truth. As a matter of fact, sometimes what they tell us is a lie. They couldn't find the money to pay people. Johns Hopkins couldn't find the fucking money. The real estate concern with with a university sort of stapled to the side couldn't find. They couldn't match the $8 an hour that I'm sure most Baltimoreans are living on. They couldn't find that. Really.
Yeah.
So they need people with leisure time. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Bullshit.
Yeah, and that was something we got into. It's like, how are these people working that need to make a living going to take off a whole day or like a week to do some of this research? They can't afford to just take off to enroll into a research project that they're not getting paid for. I mean, they're not going to be able to pay their bills or anything. It's yeah, and it also makes me wonder too, like if and when psychedelics become legal, will it be covered by Medicare? Will there be cheap treatment or the time these are pretty time consuming therapies and how much
I'm sorry. I don't think we have to wonder.
Yeah, because
when we're talking about introducing to the existing system. So just ask yourself, how hard would it be to take a week off to do ayahuasca in that set? I mean, how many hoops would you have to jump on? What kind of diagnosis would you have to get? What kind of time off from work would you have to get? I mean, what we're talking about with prescription, first of all, it's not access. Prescription is the opposite of access. It's limitation by, again, the same elite that we're supposed to trust, that I frankly don't trust. Because, look, I mean, the statistics show it's the third leading cause of death is death by doctor. Iatrogenics, third leading cause of death, just after more than car crashes, after cancer and heart attacks. There's something like between the estimates. The last I heard, I'm going to quote the wrong journal. Actually, Johns Hopkins just came out with a study. Something like fucking 300,000 people by medical malpractice. This is what they're reporting. 300,000 people. To give you an idea, about 30,000 people died from handgun deaths last year, and about 30,000 people from drunk driving. Okay, 300,000 people reported. That's not including the infections. That's not including deliberate stuff. That's not including overdose. By the way, it's something like it's in the hundreds of thousands death, but from the known side effects of drugs. That's not overdose. So you start to build up into 500,000 a year. So this is supposedly safety. So we're doing this for safety, which I say is bullshit. We're giving it over them for access when we know it's not access, right? Because medicines don't come. It's not going to make it cheaper. This also goes back to the lie of the drug policy movement that if you make something legal, that you will take violence out of it. I think that I won't go into that. We can do a whole another show about that. I think it's completely bullshit. I mean, you talk about Central America and South America, hundreds of thousands of people died and were in prison, and juntas were formed and governments were toppled over bananas and grapefruits and pineapples with a company called United Fruit. So the idea isn't if you make something legal, the violence gets out of it. The idea is if you put it in the medical structure, it becomes safer. I think it might be the opposite. We don't know. So maybe this is a chance to reimagine the world. Mm. Or we can continue. If you feel that we are at a place where at the epoch in the history of our species, that all we need is a little reform or a lot of reform even, then go and continue on that path. I think that we are not in that epoch. I think, if I want to give over my agency to the medicines and I have been telling myself, my soul, that we are not. We are at a very, very desperate space. And how do we reimagine that? How do we take that power back from these structures that are destroying us? But this is the idea of fetishism again and the witchcraft of capitalism. The idea is that you feed a fetish, and if you feed it too much blood, it will take over. Mm. Now we are going to destroy ourselves on the fetish of commodities that have no real place in the material world, that have taken on a sort of a supernatural evil, I'll just say, element, a malevolent force that is sweeping us up, that we seem to have no control unless we stop feeding the idol. Mm. And that's a big, vague sort of poetic sweep. But how do we do that? I think we start doing that by individually recognizing first our privilege, first our place in the community, and start working in community and seeing outside of these structures, because they will not produce the evolution and the revolution that is needed for us to survive as a species. I'm an old motherfucker. I'm 54. I'm going to die before it happens. You guys, I'm imagining, are you much younger just from talking to you for a minute before that, and you might see it, but certainly my niece is going to see it, my grandnieces and my grandnephews are going to see it. And this is where we're at. This is where we're at. Should we start talking about, this is a concept that came up the other day, should we start talking about palliative and hospice care for us as a species? Because we're kind of at that point. Mm-hmm. So this is it. The need seems to be to act in community and to start to think of ways around that. And I do offer that up to your listeners. But we see movements where people have done this. If you look at the psychedelic movement so far, we haven't needed them. It hasn't been perfect, but all of this has been done, including psychedelic therapy, including Ibogaine detox, including circles. All of this has been done without the superstructure, which is sort of supported by a shadow government and a shadow state and the corporate state. We've done it without it. Do we need that to legitimize ourselves? If you talk about trauma, this is like returning to the abuser. Right. What have we learned from the medicine? I've seen men and women decide to leave the abuser or decide to break the connection to the abuser. But even with all the medicine, we are so tied to this abuse that we are receiving and this abuser, this state, that we cannot break with it. But we need the analysis. We need to have the conversation that this is the problem. Mm-hmm. This is the problem. And the solution is really, I'm actually an optimist because I see transformation and evolution and revolution in people's soul on a daily basis. And I know people can do this. Create the structures locally. Work with suspicion of the superstructures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's great advice. Coming back to the community, I during the one podcast I listened to that you were just on, you made a comment about like, you know, going to Burning Man and changing the world, but like, you know, what do you do? Like, what type of footwork are we actually doing? You know, we go seek these transformative experiences, and then it's like, how do we bring it back? Do we go seek it some more? And it's kind of coming back to that quote of like, you know, you get the message, hang up the phone, you go do your work, right? And I think that's like probably the toughest part, right? Is actually going and actually maybe taking a step and making a change in your community that's really difficult.
It is difficult. You know, Alexis Briggs, who was my lawyer, and she's an incredible woman. She's moved to Holland wisely. And she's a burner, and she's someone who does real work in the world. And what she said, what really sort of shook her, and I bring this example up, was during the Occupy movement, what was needed, particularly down in Wall Street, what was needed to sustain that movement was toilets, showers, and feeding people. Who knows how to do that? Burners.
Right.
Where were they? So we have to look at intent. You know, look, parties, celebration, festival, these are so important. It's not even a small thing. It's a big thing.
Yeah.
You know, we want to have a world where we can celebrate each other and dance with each other and love each other and express ourselves. This is it. This is what we're working for. But it is not the thing. Mm-hmm. And what the witches will do is any kind of witch will use a good intention to divert you into their witchcraft. So the idea that somehow that is changing the world is naive at best. And I think that if you look at sort of the way, you know, psychedelics were used in the 60s and the way that it was brought in by the government, you know, when it was politicized and how it was depoliticized by like this vague notion of love, not a vague notion of love. The vague notion of all you need is love, who was written by a revolutionary, you know. If you see, you know, how it was diverted and diluted, you know, I see people doing ayahuasca ceremonies every weekend. Fine. But where's the other work? As a matter of fact, if you want to keep a population docile, you know, what better way than to give them the Selma? You know, go every weekend, you know, talk to grandmother, you know, continue to focus in, and then what work do you do in the community, you know? And, you know, and the only way you can express that is in a binary world, male, female, mother, goddess, father, God, Trump or Hillary. And like, these are actual choices. And, you know, and actually, and if you don't pick one of those choices, then you're the one not participating. This is the narrative that's happened. So we're up for big work or not. You know, I forget, there was some Native American elder that sometimes the realization that the shark is coming is when it's bitten you in half and you're bleeding out. But, you know, we're not going to get there from benevolent capitalism. We're not going to get there by giving Branson, you know, MDMA, or getting the sons and daughters of Warren Buffett, who are taking private jets into the desert. They're there. They're already there. The 1% is going to be actually the 20%, which I believe is the real class distinction. The 20% will be there, and they'll burn it when they're done.
So a good introduction to this concept of consumerism and self is this 3-part documentary series called Century of Self. You find that on YouTube or wherever. It
cool.
Talks about the origins coming from Edward Bernays, who is, I think, grandson or nephew of Freud. So we had all that.
The publicity guy, right?
Yeah, so it's kind of like Mad Men, but like, you know, what they were really doing. And how it even goes out into the hippie culture and the outdoor sports industry, stuff like that, to really control your finances and your attention. So it's pretty fascinating. and a good intro.
I'm writing it down right now, man.
Cool.
Yeah. I thought you were saying that this was just the introduction of after I good introduction. Now let's get to the meat of it. Yeah.
No, this is like a 3-hour documentary series.
Cool. I'll check it, man. I'll check it.
And listeners should also check that out. It's pretty awesome. So I think we talked about almost everything I wanted to get into. I'm sure we could go for like 5 hours. Maybe we'll do that sometime in the future. But where, I don't know, Kyle, anything else you want to jump into right now?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of stuff. I was thinking maybe like after this whole conversation, maybe like what you would kind of foresee the future would look like, or like maybe what your thoughts are on how we could move towards like a more integrative future with this medicine,
or how kids could get involved, people could get involved.
Yeah, how students could get involved, because we're also kind of taking this podcast in the realm of like, you know, giving information to students that might be interested in this field. And, you know, I think this conversation has been really awesome just to highlight like the kind of the shadow that's going on, and it kind of needs to be talked about. And, you know,
nice. Yeah. Where is this going? You know, I mean, that's the question, right? I think that if we go forward with the idea that there's a real dominant force that wants to commodify everything, every aspect of living, and make us all consumers. If we also go forward with the idea that our natural state is to give and to receive, and that can be, you know, demonstrated, you know, for the work of Kropotkin on that our idea that our natural state is to give and receive. If we go forward with a willingness to look at ourselves, look at our place, be hurt and forgive, and organize, then we have a chance. The thing that I increasingly, because folks are coming into this medicine, and some beautiful things are happening, including the language of community. When young people call me an elder, which I had this young woman call me the other day, you know, and I was like looking like, who the fuck you talking to, you know? And I go, me, you know, if as someone who is moving into that. You see, I'm not trying to own it, but okay, someone as an elder. The thing that gives me really hope is that people are waking up to all of this. And what really gives me hope is I might go to a conference, maybe I'm not invited to talk or whatever. I'll go to an after party because I can't afford to get in or whatever. But I show up and I suddenly find myself talking to 3, 4, 5, 6 young people who might have heard of me, and they want to talk about this. And I'm not here to beat you up if you're involved in the drug policy world and reform. I'm not here to judge you if you're in spiritual community. If you go to Burning Man, have a good time. Many of my friends are going there. I'm saying that let's start to really look at ourselves, not hurt ourselves, but look at ourselves and have an analysis, a structural analysis, personally, globally, cosmically. And I believe if we operate from that analysis in the way we conduct our lives and organize from that analysis, that we can find a way forward in the circle, because it's not a line. and that's all I really got. I think that the criticisms of, let's say, Occupy and other movements is like, well, what's the solution? I think that was the solution. The action is the solution, and what can come out of that is the solution. I am suspicious of solutions because they lead to ideology, which leads to imprisonment, which leads to what we have. I'm not talking about utopia, because we are messy. We are messy creatures. We're biologically messy creatures. We are emotionally messy. We're spiritually messy. We're intellectually messy. And we're beautiful. So let's go with our mess and like look at ourselves and be honest to that. And when I call that white privilege, I'm not calling you out as a human being. I'm not saying, like, let me say it again, that you haven't suffered, because you were born and you are drawing breath and we are suffering. What I'm saying is just to look at it, and see maybe someone is suffering with all the things that you have and this other shit, which is a heavy burden. So let's lift each other's burdens.
Beautiful words.
Well, see.
Yeah, that really things.
Yeah.
Let me just say, in terms of, there's also an issue with Iboga, and if you could put this somewhere on the website, that it's being used too much and being cultivated too much, so it's in scarcity. So go to Blessings of the Forest. There are folks in Gabon trying to do something about it. So if you've benefited from Iboga or any plant medicine, Blessings of the Forest is an organization that is working to do real good things and to make it sustainable.
Yeah, I think that also touches base on making these medicines into like a commodity. The shortages and the environmental, but that might be a totally different conversation. But that just kind of made me think about that, about how much these medicines might be used and what type of like environmental impact it might have in those traditional places where they grow.
I see. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one place where we can actually be a model for the rest of the world. And let's try to be a model for the rest of the world. And the other thing is this: if you're sitting in a room and you're mostly surrounded by folks that look like you, and then you're about to take something that or think like you or have a similar background to you, and you're about to take something very special from folks that don't look like you, think about that and think about how you can change that and how you can change that in your day-to-day life, and maybe make that part of your ceremony.
It's awesome.
So where can people find information that you might post online? Do you have a website or?
I have a website, and thank God for millennials in my life to try to get me moving on it. So I have a website. If you want to contact me, go to DimitriMugianis.com. I'm trying to get a little more active in social media. We're putting up a YouTube channel, I think, today. You can check for when I'm doing panels. We'll be doing another Race and Psychedelic panel on October 12th at the Alchemist Kitchen in New York. We have panels coming up on 12 steps in psychedelia, panels at other spaces on ritual, evolution, and revolution. And you can also go to Universalist Bwiti, which is our organization in New York.
Do you ever get Kalindi involved in those race conversations?
I'm trying. He wasn't in town, so we'll try to get him for the next one. I love Kalindi. He's a great guy. Yeah, I love Kalindi. Yeah, I admire his work, and that's an autonomous spirit, but also an elder with a huge heart and intellect. I really admire his work, and I admire him.
Cool. It's good to hear you might get him out to the city. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a ton for your time. Really appreciate it, and hope.
My pleasure, dude. I can't afford therapy lately, so I just do podcasts.
Hey, it's sharing your story. Yeah,
that's it. I feel better.
That's it. That's all. Thanks for listening to Psychedelics Today with Kyle and Joe. That was Dimitri Mugianis. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had some new and interesting thoughts from a controversial voice in the psychedelic world. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, comments, or even start a discussion on our Facebook wall if you want to get some attention and discussion with the rest of everybody out there. Kyle and I probably will have a follow-up on this, just kind of have an offline talk without a guest. It'll be just us, and we'll be talking about this interview because there was a lot brought up that really I think we need to talk about further. So really hope to have Dimitri on the show again. Can't wait. Thanks again for listening. We really appreciate it. If you want to help us out, just take 30 seconds, go to iTunes, search Psychedelics Today, and subscribe. Thanks a lot. We really appreciate you listening. Thanks. Bye.